So today we're going to be talking about where you're running from, what are you running to. But before we do that, I want to help you remember back several years ago when out of nowhere, and actually nobody that I could find knows where these banners or these billboards came from, who was paying for it. And there was a number of them that would show up on Sunday morning. So show the first one if you don't mind. Jeremiah. Let's meet at my house Sunday before the game. You remember these? Love the wedding, invite me to the marriage. Will the road you're on get you to my place? Need directions? These were all subscribed with God, by the way, at the end. I love you, and you, and you, and it kept going. My way is the highway. Some things are written in stone. Keep using my name in vain, and I'll make your rush hour longer. It's one of my favorite ones. What part of thou shalt not don't you understand? You think it's hot here? And then the very last one, and I think this is my favorite one, is don't make me come down there. Except for Jesus did, right? Now, the reason I bring all those up is because I believe that God wants to talk to us. He wants to speak to us, and he's trying. Now, this is a funny way of doing it. It was these billboards. They were up for a number of years, actually. I kept hearing about them, seeing them on the internet. Most of the time, we were over in Crimea when it was happening, so I didn't see them in person. But I love the concept, right? And it's just, isn't it good just to make you think, is that really God? Don't make me come down there. You think it's hot down there? God speaks to us. Sometimes we don't want to hear it. So we're going to look at 1 Kings chapter 19. I can't say exactly where this came from. What I mean is where the idea for this came from, except for I was reading the scriptures one day and this just popped out. And God seemed to be really hitting me hard as to how this applies to us in today's world. So 1 Kings chapter 19, verse 1. Let me give you context real quick. Elijah was the prophet of God. He had done tremendous things, unbelievable things up to this point. God had used him. It was supernatural in how he used him, the prophecies that were given, the miracles he performed, all of these things. And so he gets to this point, though, where Jezebel and Ahab are his mortal enemies. Actually, God's enemies, but he took it personally. And so when we get here, at this point, Elijah has been the one instrumental in killing all of the prophets of Baal. Those who had not submitted to God, who didn't want to serve him, were trying to kill him. So when he gets to verse 1, it goes this. When Ahab got home, he told Jezebel, who was his wife, everything, who was, by the way, she was pagan. She was not a Christian or a Jew at all. She was very much a pagan. Everything that Elijah had done, including all the ways he had killed all the prophets of Baal. So Jezebel sent this message to Elijah. May the gods strike me and even kill me if by this time tomorrow I've not killed you just as you killed them. Elijah was afraid and fled for his life. He went to Beersheba, a town in Judah, and he left his servant there. Then he went alone into the wilderness, traveling all day. He sat down under a solitary broom tree and prayed that he might die. I've had enough, Lord. Take my life, for I'm no better than my ancestors who have already died. Verse 5, then he lay down and slept under the broom tree, but as he was sleeping, an angel touched him and told him, get up and eat. He looked around. That would kind of freak you out, right? He looked around, and there beside his head was some bread baked on hot stones and a jar of water. So he ate and drank and lay down again. Then the angel of the Lord came again and touched him. Get up and eat some more, or the journey ahead will be too much for you. So he got up and ate and drank. And the food gave him enough strength to travel 40 days and nights to Mount Sinai, the mountain of God. Then he came to a cave where he spent the night. But the Lord said to him, what are you doing here, Elijah? Elijah replied, I have zealously served the Lord God Almighty, but the people of Israel have broken their covenant, torn down your altars, killed every one of your prophets. I'm the only one left, and now they are trying to kill me too. Now, I added emotion and inflection in that because I think it was very emotional for him. He was struggling. So God responds in verse 11, "Go out, stand before me on the mountain," the Lord told him. And as Elijah stood there, the Lord passed by, and a mighty windstorm hit the mountain. It was such a terrible blast that the rocks were torn loose. But the Lord was not in the wind. After the wind, there was an earthquake, but the Lord was not in the earthquake. And after the earthquake, there was a fire, but the Lord was not in the fire. And after the fire, there was the sound of a gentle whisper. And when Elijah heard it, he wrapped his face in his cloak and went and stood at the entrance of the cave, and a voice said, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" He replied again, "I have zealously served the Lord God Almighty, but the people of Israel broke their covenant, torn down your altars, killed every one of your prophets. I'm the only one left, and now they're trying to kill me." Then the Lord said, "Go back the way you came, travel to the wilderness of Damascus. When you arrive there, anoint Hazael to be king over Aram." Just to give you a little bit of context here, he had been in Damascus, or he'd been up in Syria. He went all the way to Sinai. You know how many miles that is? Across a hot desert? A long ways. And then God says, "Go back." But I think the key point here and what I want to focus on is, what are you doing here? What are you running from? What are you running to? Anybody here ever experienced fear in their lives? Really fear? I remember when Janice and the girls were almost kidnapped. That was scary. I remember the first week when a guy was murdered outside of our door there in Crimea. That was scary. I remember when we were threatened by the KGB. I remember all of these things, folks. There was fear. Now, how do we normally respond in fear? Sometimes anger, that's true. More often, though, we try to skedaddle. Man, we're finding a safe place, right? Sometimes, and oftentimes there is anger in that. So thank you for bringing that up. All of us, though, have had that in our lives in one way or another. If you haven't lived very long. Isn't that about right? If you have not experienced fear, you'll get there. You may not want it, but you're going to get there, I promise. And I think the question God is asking is, what are you running from? And so he phrases it to Elijah, what are you doing here? Well, so we're going to look at that today. Do you remember the Bible study, by the way, where there was this young guy who faced a bear and he killed it? And then he killed the lion. A little while later, he ran up against a giant, and he took this little rock and threw it in, was going to throw it at him, and except he looked at that giant and he says, "Nope, that's not for me," and he ran home. Do you remember that story? Me either. It wasn't there, right? That story is not in the Bible. What you have is David taking little things like little rocks and throwing it with this little sling and killing that big giant. He was looking, there was fear there. He went against the norm. What kind of Goliaths do you have in your life? What are they? What threatens you? What are you running from? I'm not going to answer that directly because we're going to get to that. I remember when I was a little kid and my mom and my dad were trying to teach me how to ride a bicycle. Remember that? We had this driveway and it was, a small, short slant, grass on both sides. There was rocks in the middle, but there's not much going to happen to you. If you fall off, you maybe scrape your arm, and I did that anyway all the time, so it was no big deal. But I kept falling. Anybody else do that too? Get up, you try to pedal as fast as you can, and you fall over, right? So do you stop? No, I want to ride that bike. Hey, man, all my neighbors were doing it. I knew if they could do it, I could do it. So I was going to do it again. So I would get on that bike and pedal. And my mom, she wasn't very big, about 5'1", weighed about 90 pounds. And she'd be trying to guide me, and then after a while, she let loose, and I didn't know that. That scared me even more, right? But after a while, I learned how to do it. My point is this. Oftentimes, the process of failing, being fearful, and getting up and going again is where we actually grow. That process, my granddad and my mom and my grandma, they used to raise quarter horses and paint horses. And when I used to ride a little bit, I'm no good at it, but I always fell off because they would knock me off. And Grandpa would say, you get back up there. And so I'd climb back up and I'd fall off again. It didn't matter, but you kept doing it, even in the midst of failure, which, by the way, does anybody like that? None of us like it. And yet, it's through the failing that we learn. There's a lot of things I don't know. Lots. One of the things I love about being a follower of Christ, though, is I don't have to know it all. You don't have to know it all. We're going to fall. We're going to have fear. We get up and we keep going. We keep doing what God is asking. I just want to say that failure is a reality. Failure is a reality. We need to learn what God is going to do with it. God uses our own shortcomings. He uses our successes. He uses our failures for His glory. How many times has that happened where I've done it, I've really messed up, and God still uses it to touch somebody's heart? Hard to understand, right? Well, Romans 8:28 says it this way, and we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love Him, who've been called according to His purpose. Not that we have it together. God's the one who leads us and guides us. He's the one who works through our failures and our successes. Janice has a comic strip on our refrigerator, and it's these little kids, and I've forgotten the name of it all of a sudden. But anyway, the boy was asking, Daddy, do I have to be perfect in order to succeed in this world? And his dad says, no. It's the process. You'll go here and here and here and here, and your successes and your failures all add together, so at the end of your life, you'll be exactly what you should have been. So in Galatians 6, chapter 9, or chapter 6, verse 9, it says this, let us not grow weary of doing good, for in due season we will reap if we do not give up. So we don't give up. We keep trying. We keep trying to be what God asks us to be, regardless of our situation. That process is what shapes us. It's a lot more fun, I'll say this, to be around people who are humble than those who are proud. Have you ever noticed that? Why? Because people who are proud, they know everything, right? They don't need any advice. They don't need any help. One of my number of my friends in Crimea, one of the things that they would do is we didn't know anything there. I didn't know where to buy bread. I didn't know where to get groceries. I didn't know how to find stuff, go pay electricity, do all of these things. And when I did figure out how to do it, I'd say, well, let me do it. And they go, whoa, whoa, whoa. Are you trying to take away my blessing? Because they wanted to serve us. They wanted to serve us. So it was the process of learning how to work, how to be humble, and not assuming that we know everything. We don't have to not have fear. Now, I'm saying all that because our world today there is fear, isn't there? Look at our world. Look at those around you. Look at what's going on, and there's a lot of fear. I don't want to minimize the fear. I don't want to minimize that. And there are going to be times when we're going to be fearful. It's okay. Just recognize that God is not in the fear. For perfect love casts out all. Jim? Perfect love casts out all fear. Okay? Perfect love casts out all fear. When we're in Christ, when we're cuddling close to Him, if you will, I love the imagery of John, the disciple, and it talks about him leaning into Jesus. And I think spiritually that's what we're called to do, is to lean in close. There's comfort. Perfect love, that is God, casts out all fear. We don't need to be living in fear. Now, we're talking about Elijah, and he's running. You know what? If that happened to me, I'd probably run too. Maybe not that far. I can't run that fast, but I'd have been gone. He's not the only one in the Bible that happened to. Remember Jonah? Now, in his case, he was being called to go to Nineveh. Well, context-wise, the Ninevites had come into Israel before and had killed a lot of people. And there's a likelihood that Jonah was from the area and maybe had relatives or friends that the Ninevites had killed. So you can see why he didn't want to go to Nineveh to share the gospel, to share God's love, because those are the ones who killed my own friends. He didn't want to do that. I don't blame him. Now, in that case, we're talking about him going to the whale, trying to get away. And I think sometimes we think of escape in that term, those terms I've heard people say recently, and you have too probably. Well, if so-and-so gets elected, I'm leaving the country. Or if the other so-and-so, they're called so-and-sos, by the way, the other so-and-so gets elected, I'm leaving the country. Okay, go. Escape is not always geographic, though. Escape can be emotional as well, can't it? It can be spiritual. Escape from what we're afraid of, in whatever way that it might be. Sometimes we try to escape because we don't like those messages that we heard from God. We ignore the scriptures, we ignore what God's doing because I don't like it. It's not comfortable. It doesn't fit with my plan, it doesn't fit in my narrative. We want to escape it because we don't like it. Funny thing is, I've never seen where God says, and by the way, this is what I'm going to do. What do you think? Has he asked you that? No, he doesn't need your input. But what's our general way of doing it? Now, God, I've been noticing, you know what, if you should be doing this. God's going, what? No, that's not what he's saying at all. We tend to, those of you who have hearing aids, I know that some of you guys do this. I won't talk about the ladies. But some of you guys, I know you take them out because you share that once in a while. Why? So you don't have to hear, right? Okay, you don't have to admit it. I won't poke fun at anybody, but you know what I'm talking about. Sometimes it's so bad, though, that we just want to give up. That happened with Jonah and Elijah. In Jonah, and I've forgotten the chapter, forgive me, it's chapter 1. He says this, he says, pick me up, throw me into the sea, it'll become calm. I know that it is my fault that the great storm has come upon you. What was he really saying? Let me die. Wasn't he? I'm tired. I'm done. I am not going to do this, God. I hate it. I hate those people. Just let me die. And in 1 Kings 19:4, Elijah says the same thing. He says he sat down under that broom tree and he prayed that he might die. I've had enough, Lord. Take my life. Let me be done. Sometimes we'd rather die than listen to the voice that God is speaking to us with. And you know, in some ways, when we have to let go, there is a death of sorts that happens in us. When we come to the point where we say, okay, God, I'm done. Please take over. That there was I forgot the country singer's name, but Jesus Take the Wheel. Remember that song? I can't remember who it was. Carrie something, I think. Carrie Underwood, that's right. It was. Jesus Take the Wheel. Symbolically, isn't that really what we've come to that point? Say, Jesus, take the wheel. I can't deal with it anymore. I don't know what to do further. And it requires a death of sorts where we have to let go. I remember when we were in Crimea, one of the things that we saw, this was frequent, was more ladies in the church than guys. So oftentimes we'd pray for the guys, of course, their husbands, so that they would come to Christ. This didn't happen once. This happened many times, that when the guys would come to Jesus, the women would get hopping mad. You know why? Because it messed up their plans. It messed up the narrative, the ideas that they had, and he came to Christ, became a follower of Jesus, and all of a sudden, she couldn't be complaining all the time about this degenerate. Now, that sounds funny. I've seen it the other way too, by the way. But most often, in Crimea at least, it was with the women. They didn't like it because they had to let go. And folks, that's where we're at oftentimes. That's what's going on with Elijah. He has this mindset. We're going to get to that in just a moment. He has this mindset of what should be, and it's not pulling out the way he wants it to be. And it makes him mad. He's frustrated. Just like Jim said, it makes us mad. but he's also depressed. Super depressed. Anybody here even close to that? I hope not. But in our world, they are. This pandemic has depressed a lot of people. How do you interact? What do you do? How's fellowship? The death rate among older people who are isolated has gone up because they don't have the interaction with people where we need that. They're depressed. Well, I found out 4 easy steps to be depressed, just so you know, real quick. 1, wear yourself out. Just wear yourself out. Secondly, shut other people out. You don't need them anyway, right? Third, have unrealistic expectations of how things will turn out. And then last, leave God out. You do all those things, I promise you'll get depressed. Essentially, that's what's going on here with Elijah and with Jonah, for that matter. And when we're depressed, there's other things usually going on, but they believe several lies, and I want to look at those real quick. The first lie is this: I'm all alone, there's no one else living for God, and God doesn't care for me. Now, you've probably heard people not say that directly, but say it. Allude to it. God doesn't care for me. He doesn't love us. He doesn't love me. I'm lost. And yet, when you go back to the story with Elijah in 1 Kings 19, what do you see God doing? Sends the angel twice, and what's he do? He feeds him. He gives him nourishment because he says you're going to need this for 40 more days. God takes care of him. Then God shows up when the wind comes, when the earthquake's there, when the fire is there, and I'm missing one other. He comes and he's not in there. And in the last one, it says he's in the whisper. Second lie, though, is that God needs me. You know what? It's easy to fall into that. And Elijah does. Twice he says it this way, where he basically says to God, listen, God, I'm indispensable. I'm the only one left. Doesn't he? Have any of you ever been there? I have. I'm ashamed to say it. Where I thought that something was dependent on me, and it's not. And so God says to him, I've got 7,000 more. You think you're all by yourself, buddy? No, you're not. But that's a lie oftentimes that we will buy into. Thirdly, there's a lie that you all know. God helps those who... If that was the case, you know what? Judas would be a saint. Think about that. If that was the case, Judas, who betrayed Jesus, would be a saint because he took it upon himself to solve the problem that Jesus had. It's heresy. It's not what Jesus asks. It's not where he goes. No. You know where that came from, don't you, by the way? Benjamin Franklin came up with that. That's not biblical, not even close. God helps those who obey him and trust him. That's who he helps. Those who are seeking after him to obey him, who do what he asks. Then he had this whisper. They have this whisper, and it says that at the end of that whisper, God asks the question, what are you doing here, Elijah? And he goes again. Now, I just want to say that I don't think that when God asks that question, that he's being accusatory. He's not saying, Elijah, that is so stupid. What are you doing here? I'm not saying it like that. I think he really is saying, Elijah, what are you doing here? As a way of making him think, what are you doing here? In Hebrews 12, chapter 12, verse 2, it says this, let us fix our eyes on Jesus, the author, perfecter of our faith. For the joy set before him endured the cross, scorning its shame, and sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. I think what God is doing in that whisper is revealing himself. He's revealing himself to Elijah. He wants him to see it through the whisper. Oftentimes, isn't that how he speaks to you? It's how he speaks to me. Oftentimes, it'll be through a whisper. He's revealing himself. And that's why it says in Hebrews there, fix your eyes on Jesus. Fix your eyes on him. He's the joy set before, who for the joy set before him endured the cross. What I'm really getting at is that God was inviting Elijah to take part in his presence. There was a study done by Duke University years ago, and one of their conclusions was this: attendance in church, that is, with other believers, leads to lower rates of depression and anxiety. Now, it's significant, and I didn't get the statistics, but it was very significant. And they wondered what was going on. It's being with people who have trust in what God's doing, who believe in him. Another study that they did as well was a study on peace of mind. And one of the things they found out is those who are in church, those who are with other believers, there's an absence of suspicion and resentment. They don't live in the past. They're not wasting time and energy finding conditions that they can change. There's a whole bunch of them. I'm not going to go into all that. But when a person is weighed down and depressed, what do they look most at? Themselves. When you're depressed, when you're anxious, what do you look at? Yourself. Navel gazing, I used to call it, right? And we look at ourselves and we're going, this is not good. I don't like this. I want to change this. God, what's going on? We're depressed. We're frustrated. We want something that's going on. And how do we get out of that? By focusing on something else. Martin Luther, who established the Lutheran Church, I believe it was in the 1400s, 1500s. After about 10 years of serving and of fighting, the local governments, other reformers, and others fell into a point of depression to the point where he couldn't function. He would go into his bedroom for weeks and wouldn't come out. One day his wife, and you got to love this lady, she was bright, she was smart. She walked in there dressed in total black. He looks up and he says, "What is going on? Did somebody die?" And she looked at him. "Well, from the way you're acting, I'd say that God did. God died." And you know what? We look at ourselves so much we forget that God is alive. We don't see what he's doing. And so we come back to this. What are you doing here? Did God not know Elijah's problem? The issue was that God needs us to say it. He just wants us to say it. God, I don't know how to do this. God, I'm frustrated. God, this seems out of control. God, this seems not fair. I think most people in this congregation today would say that in some way. What's going on? Elijah needed to vocalize what was going on in his life, what he thought the problem was. But God deals with false beliefs. And so what does he say here? He says, the lies you're believing are not true. And he says there are over 7,000 who have not bowed the knee to Baal and whose mouth has not kissed him. In other words, you're only seeing a small part of the picture. Folks, that's what I want to say. What we're looking at in our world today, we are so narrow-minded. Maybe that's not the way. Narrow-focused. I don't know. I don't want to say you're narrow-minded. I want to say that we're so focused narrowly that we miss the big picture of what God's doing. We somehow have put ourselves in that place and forgotten that he's really the king of the world. Not our politics, not our own opinions, not what we see on the news, nothing like that. It's a lie. They're not true. You know, Jesus specialized in that. In John, I believe I can't remember, sorry, 12, 13, 14, those chapters right in there. Jesus said, the truth will set you free. Free from what? Free from all the lies, free from all the me stuff, free from our own perceptions, and free for what God wants to do through us. Now, what I love about what we see with Elijah is he went back. He rejoined the race. He rejoined what God wanted to do, and he went all the way back up to Damascus. I mean, he probably went through 2 or 3 pairs of sandals. I mean, folks, that's a long ways down and a long ways back. But he did it. He rejoined. He got past himself to see that God was moving. In Galatians 5, verse 7, it says, Paul says this. He says, "You were running a good race. Who cut in on you to keep you from obeying the truth?" Really could apply to Elijah, couldn't it? Who cut in on you and fed you those lies? And then why did you believe them? That kind of persuasion does not come from the one who calls you. And I want to say lastly, what he did very last of all is that God gave Elijah a task. He didn't just leave him in the desert. He says, "Okay, now, man, you go back." And so he tells him to do 2 things. One, go anoint Hazael as the future king. And then secondly, he says, go find Elisha and disciple him. Take him under your wing and disciple him. One of the best ways to get out of depression, to get past all of the fear, is go serve someone else. There's many of you in this body that I really appreciate because of your hearts of service. And I see how you do that. You reach other people. You love on them. And in our community, it's everywhere. I think it's fantastic. That service gets our eyes off of ourselves, where we're serving Christ and not ourselves. In the 1600s, there was a man named John Donne, and he was a very brilliant man. King James I actually appointed him as the dean of St. Paul's Cathedral in London. Well, in 1623, he came down with the bubonic plague, the Black Death, they called it back then. And he thought he was going to die. As he was convalescing or working through that whole process of being sick and thinking he was going to die, he wrote a book called Devotions Upon Emergent Occasions. And in that, it was just a bunch of devotions and poems that he wrote about how to deal with this, what he thought he was going to die, how to deal with that. Fascinating book. Well, later that was developed into a book, or a HBO movie version that was written, and I'm trying to remember the name of it, and I've forgotten it. It was about a lady named Vivian Baring, who was a literary scholar and so forth. Anyway, she's got cancer, and her professor, Dr. Ashford, comes in when she's dying in the bed in the hospital. And instead of just being very standoffish, she takes off her shoes and climbs into bed with this lady just to give her a hug before she passes. She was in the throes of death at that moment. And this Dr. Ashford, she said she knew that the lady who was dying had been a scholar about Donne's works. And she said, "Would you like me to read some of his stuff?" And she said, "No." Instead, the doctor pulled out a book, and it was called The Runaway Bunny. Has anybody ever read that? Have you? It's a great book, isn't it? It's just a funny book. And this little bunny rabbit, the baby bunny, decides one day it's going to run away. And so he goes to his mom. He says, "Mommy, I'm going to run away." And his mommy said, "If you run away, I'm going to chase you. I'll follow after you because you are my little bunny." And the little bunny says, "No, I'm not going to let you catch me. If you chase me, I'm going to jump into the river. I'm going to become a trout, and I'm going to swim away." And Mama Bunny says, "Go ahead, jump in that river, become a little trout. I'm going to become a fisherman, and I'm going to follow after you, and I'm going to catch you." And the lady who was in bed with her, she says, "Look at that, a little allegory of the soul. No matter where it hides, God will find it." Folks, that's really how I want to end this morning. You can't get away from God. You have a choice. If you run from him, he runs after you. If you run to him, he embraces you. But wherever you are, wherever you go, his eyes of love will always follow. And it's exactly the same thing that we see with Elijah and with Jonah. And you know what? With every one of you as well.